Okay, hi friends. So this lecture today, um, yeah, yikes, this angle. Anyway, sad that I can't be there actually in class giving this lecture because I think this is a really important lecture actually for me to have been present giving because we are going to be talking about sexual selection today, and sexual selection has proven to be a controversial part of this course. In particular over the last couple of semesters that we've taught this. And I was hoping that as a trans person giving a lecture on sexual selection, that might, um, make it less controversial and make it more palatable and perhaps bring up topics that you might not otherwise hear in a sort of traditional lecture on sexual selection. So that said, you're going to have to deal with me talking to my laptop while I give this lecture. So anyway, let's get started. We're going to be talking about sexual selection today, and I have sufficiently had enough cups of coffee to replace my usual Coke Zero / Diet Dr. Pepper moment that I would normally have in class. So hopefully we stay alert and attentive this whole time. All right. So last week, many weeks ago, we talked about natural selection, and we talked about evolution and how our understanding in the global north of evolution came to be. We talked about Darwin. We talked about how natural selection plays a role in what sort of species evolve and make it past various environmental filters. Unfortunately, we didn't get to do the cool in-class activity that I normally have you all do, but hopefully we will be able to do a modified version of it in the Slack tomorrow, but we'll see how that goes. So today we're going to talk about the evolutionary rationale for not just natural selection, but also sexual reproduction. Why do most species, most animal species anyway, have sex? Why do we sexually reproduce? Why is that an adaptation that we have developed over time as living organisms? And finally, is there actually an evolutionary rationale for this? Is this real, so to speak? Or is this just something that exists, a field that exists because this is the way that human beings interpret the biological world around us? And so hopefully we get through all of these questions today. And I wish that I was there so that you could ask me questions, but we'll save that for the Zoom that we have. So make sure you write all your questions down before that. All right. So before we get to sexual reproduction, let's talk about asexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction seems to have come first. It's the what we call ancestral condition. We see it in bacteria. We see it in a lot of single-celled organisms, and asexual reproduction, meaning an organism, a life form, can just produce essentially a clone, a younger clone of itself, asexually, without having to actually mate with another species, another individual from the same species. And asexual reproduction seems to offer many advantages. For one, there's no need to spend energy or risk looking for a mate. So bacteria don't have to use Tinder. Even my partner laughed at that one, so that's a good joke, and you better laugh. Also, natural selection should, in theory, favor those individuals that maximize their genes for reproduction. So when you produce an offspring asexually, that offspring is 100% related to me rather than 50%. So if I'm a superior individual, then I'm going to make another individual that's 100% the same as me, and that's also going to be superior, and therefore it's the best all around, right, so to speak. Another benefit to being asexual is that asexual species can reproduce in principle whenever they prefer. They don't need a mating season. They don't need to be, for example, in many mammals, they don't need to be ovulating. And so, in principle, you could just reproduce at any time, and therefore, bacteria go through several generations, like in a week. If you are a very well-adapted, superior species, then if you reproduce asexually, you can pass on your adaptive traits without diluting them with your mate's traits, without mixing them with a mate's traits. You just pass these perfect, undiluted genes on to your offspring. It's an ideal situation, hypothetically speaking. Of course, we know that that's not really the case, and that's because everything is evolving at the same time. So there is no such thing as a superior being, an individual, right? So in nature, selective forces are often characteristic of certain interactions in an ecological web, such as between predators and prey, or parasite and host. But since the predators and the parasites are always evolving, then the hosts and the prey always have to be constantly changing to stay one step ahead of extinction. Okay, and this is a really, really, really important concept, the Red Queen hypothesis. The Red Queen, of course, being the Red Queen from Alice in Wonderland. This is a quote that kind of sums it all up. Now here you see it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. So because my predator is evolving, I'm going to need to evolve so that that predator doesn't make me extinct. Because if that predator evolves to the point where it just consumes my whole species and I never evolve to meet that challenge, then I will go extinct. So I have to evolve to meet that challenge, right, of evolution so I don't go extinct. This is the Red Queen hypothesis and the foundational principle for sexual selection and the idea of mating. So the benefits, of course, right, are the things that we thought maybe were not a benefit when we talked about asexual reproduction 2 slides ago, and that is genetic variation. So again, I said if I reproduce asexually, I pass all of my genes on to the individual, but per the Red Queen hypothesis, eventually my predator is going to catch up with me. Okay, so by mating, the dilution of my genes is actually a good thing because I produce genetic variation in my offspring, which now has these tools to navigate a changing environment, right? To navigate variables that are not constant from one generation to the next, because my predator also has evolved from one generation to the next. So actually, sexual reproduction was itself likely part of a natural selection. That natural selection dictated that we needed to have sex in order to keep up. Okay, so even though it is sexual selection, it's probably a result of natural selection deciding that sexual selection was necessary. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, but of course the benefit of sex is really contextually dependent. So we're going to get into that, and we're going to get into some of the nuances of it. But the idea that two individuals of the same species have sex and that actually produces a better outcome is not really debated. That's not really a debate in the biological community. That's not really a debate that necessarily is one that we're going to have. We are going to talk about some of the interpretations of sexual selection, though, later on in this lecture. Excuse me. I have a drink of my Crystal Light. Of course, there are advantages to both asexual and sexual reproduction. So there are some creatures which take advantage of both asexual and sexual lifestyle reproduction, reproductive sort of mechanisms. An example of this is an aphid. If any of you have gardens, you're probably very familiar with aphids. They are the bane of my existence for many of my vegetables. So in the spring, you have your foundress aphid, kind of like the original sort of sexless aphid. And then in the summer, the foundress becomes asexual and reproduces asexually as a female. And some of those females are wingless, and some of them have wings, and they kind of alternate between the two. But ultimately, the wingless female goes from an asexual state to a sexual state. And during this sexual producing asexual state, some of the wingless females become sexual males. So they actually change sexes over their life cycle to become sexual males, and then those sexual males mate with some of the asexual females that became sexual, and you end up with a sexual wingless female. Okay, I froze. Okay, I'm back. So you have the in case you missed that, the sexual producing asexual female. Some of them become sexual males, some of them become sexual wingless females. They mate, make some eggs in the winter, and then those eggs go on to hatch into a sexless foundress. Okay, so you have an asexual and a sexual part of the cycle here, and you also have some changing of sex. Some, if you want to call it transsexuality, we can call it that if you'd like. Okay, so then let's define the two modes here. So we have natural selection, which is basically the ways in which our external environment, like weather, food, predators, prey, extreme conditions, etc., apply selective pressure in the evolution that results from that of traits that enhance your survival. Okay, and perhaps reproduction. Sexual reproduction, again, as I mentioned, is part of a natural selective process. Then we get to sexual selection, which is by many considered to be a subset of natural selection, right? Where you have sexual mates and competitors of your own species applying selective pressure in the evolution of traits that enhance just reproduction, not necessarily survival, right? So with sexual selection, we're concerned about whether you as an individual are someone that wants to mate and wants to be mated with. Ideally, the offspring that you produce then are better suited for survival. And potentially the mates are selected based on whether they will produce offspring that will survive. Okay, so sexual selection is really just how mates and competitors of your own species apply selective pressure in the evolution of traits that enhance your ability to reproduce. Does that make sense? Okay, I'll give you a second. Kind of think about the differences between natural selection and sexual selection. They're similar, but they're different. Sexual selection is all about, are you being selected to reproduce? Ideally, you're being selected because you're likely to produce an offspring that will survive. Okay. So here are some examples of animals that mate sexually. And in both of these examples, I'm showing the female and the male. And so let me define those terms, because I am going to use the term female and male. Female refers to individuals of a species that will carry the offspring, or will produce the ovum, the eggs, that will become the offspring. Males are the individuals of a species that provide the sperm, which fertilize the egg, which produce the offspring. That's how we're referring to this. And so one thing that we do notice when we look at species that have males and females, the males and females look different. They're the same species, but in many cases they look dramatically different. For example, beetles perhaps have different length legs, shininess of their shells. Lizards, different colors versus very blandly colored. Butterflies, of course, caribou. Some caribou have antlers. The males have antlers and the females do not. And so why do these differences in sexual characteristics persist between males or sperm providing and females or egg providing, ovum providing members of the same species? Let's talk about that for a second. Some of you might know the answer already. Maybe you've had a class that touched on these things, but let's go through them anyway. And to get us started with that, I am going to show this video, which you are also welcome to watch on your own, but I am going to show here, and I believe I have it open. Am I still recording? Yes. Sorry, technology is hard. Okay, here we go.
About how species evolve and why they look and act the way they do. Charles Darwin was the first to recognize the evolutionary significance of sex. He came to it because his theory of natural selection had a major problem. It beautifully explained why all polar bears have heavy coats. Over time, any trait that improves an individual's chances of survival should spread through the entire population. But it offered no help in explaining the wild extravagances found throughout nature, like the peacock's tail.
Yeah, Darwin had a real problem with peacocks. In fact, he once said, "The sight of a peacock makes me sick," because he really didn't understand how it could evolve.
An extreme reaction, perhaps, but it is hard to see a peacock's tail as something other than an impediment to his survival.
They're heavy, they're difficult to carry around, they take a lot of energy to grow, they're conspicuous, and basically they're going to slow an animal down if it's running away from a predator.
And it wasn't just the peacock's tail that Darwin's theory of natural selection couldn't explain. There were also the elaborately ornamented carapaces of beetles, and the Baroque extravagance of butterflies, and even the delicate songs of birds. Theologians of his day argued that God created ornate flowers and feathers to inspire man's wonder and devotion. Darwin was convinced there had to be an evolutionary explanation, just as there had to be an evolutionary explanation for why so many of nature's ornaments are seen only on males.
If natural selection is operating on all organisms the same, why is it in nature that you can see differences between males and females? And these differences are actually quite large. Things like antlers or large body size in males that are clearly connected to maleness or femaleness, as if there were two paths. And this really doesn't make sense if you accept evolution by natural selection that should be operating the same on everybody.
It took him several decades to think of it, but eventually he happened upon the idea of sexual selection, which is really Darwin's most ingenious idea, I think. These ornaments are not for our good, they're to advertise each individual's fitness, its goodness as a mate to the opposite sex of its own species. In a sexually reproducing species, survival is no good if you don't find a mate. If you don't convince somebody that you're good enough to copulate with, to have offspring with, your genes will die with you. You won't leave any descendants.
Darwin saw two strategies at work in the courtship idiosyncrasies of different species. For males, it's competition. For females, it's choice. Males fight for access to or control over the females themselves, or a resource females need, like food or territory. Sometimes this competition gets downright nasty. But it's just as likely the males of a species will follow the path epitomized by John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever. The path of the peacock. Seduction through sexual display. This is where female choice comes in.
Female choice is that part of sexual selection that has to do with females choosing particular males over others. You would expect that the female who invests more per egg, per offspring, should be much more choosy about who she has offspring with, who she combines her genes with. Whereas the male who's investing so little, you would expect that he wouldn't care so much.
Darwin's contemporaries had no trouble with male competition. But females actively directing evolution through their choice of mates, that was too much.
This was the aspect of sexual selection that Victorians really had trouble with. They couldn't imagine that mere female animal brains could be shaping something as grand and important as evolution itself.
In those days, females didn't have choices. Males decided who they were to marry, for example, and females really didn't actually have that much say in the matter.
So radical was the idea of female choice that it was more than a century before anyone tested it. Marion Petrie's experiments with peacocks were among the first. According to sexual selection theory, peacocks grow their tails because peahens pay attention to them. And peahens pay attention because only a healthy, fit, strong peacock can afford to grow one. To test that, Petrie measured the tail lengths of a captive population of peacocks.
145.
Then she charted exactly which males the females chose over an entire mating season. Her data left little doubt. To peahens, size matters. Next, Petrie tried reducing the number of eye spots in some otherwise well-endowed tails. The result was a lonely mating season for the trimmed birds. Finally, Petrie started playing matchmaker.
We paired females with males with big trains, and we paired females with males with small trains. And then we looked at how being paired to a male with a big train, what effect that had on the performance of the female's offspring. And what we found is that if you were mated to a male with an elaborate train, your offspring survived a lot better. Paternity does matter.
Peacocks are a classic case of evolution operating through sexual selection. Males compete for the opportunity to mate, and females hold out for the best genes. When females choose a trait that is an honest indicator of good genes, that trait spreads throughout the population over generations. It can also become highly exaggerated. It's all a logical consequence of the differing reproductive strategies of males who have lots of sperm and females who have fewer eggs. But the goal isn't just to have offspring. The young have to survive long enough to have their own offspring. Sometimes that requires paying as much attention to behavioral traits as to physical ones.
Okay, that's where things start to get weird. So first of all, that Jeffrey Miller guy is a freaking creep in that video, and I meant to give that warning before I played it, but anyway, he's a creep. And I'm going to show the less creepy parts of him in it. Number two, you probably noticed that there are a few tropes at play when we talk about sexual selection. And those tropes, which we'll get to, I think they're, on this slide, are the choosy female and the competitive, violent male, right? So we have observed some of these things in animals, but the attribution of words like choosy female and violent or competitive male are entirely crafted and manufactured by human beings doing this research. So remember, in science, there is science and there are scientific results, but all of that science is being done by actual human beings, right? So it's impossible to disentangle our human vocabulary, our human interpretations of things from what actually we're observing. Okay, so that video from PBS, which you may recognize the voice of Liam Neeson, is a bit old and dated, even though it's only from the early 2000s, with some of the ways that the language that they use and the ways that they refer to sort of males and females and all of that. So we're going to break that down and hopefully have a really good discussion of that when we get together to talk about this, like at least via Zoom. So the general idea is that often males of a species produce a lot of sperm and therefore compete to be chosen by a female to mate with. Females put a lot of energy, physical energy, reproductive energy, into producing an egg, which they then want to be fertilized by a male of that species. And so therefore, they are the ones, essentially, that are selecting the males with whom to mate. Why are these differences in behavior persisting? And why would they be adaptive and naturally selected for? I think I touched on that, right? There's this investment asymmetry hypothesis, and that is that males have quote-unquote cheap sperm. So they're not really as invested materially or energetically in the creation and rearing of offspring, whereas females have less eggs, and so they've put more resources into gestating and rearing their young. This is a risky business, and so they have more limited reproductive opportunities, and so therefore they want the best outcome. So you can see how this scientific interpretation has led to the human behavioral interpretation, and I ended that PBS video right before they get into the behavioral stuff, which I feel like is super problematic. I also feel like that video in general is pretty problematic, but I wanted to show you the experiment that Marion Petrie did with the peacocks, because I think that's really interesting and illustrative. But so the danger is that this thinking, this investment asymmetry hypothesis, leads to a culture where males are essentially excused, human males are essentially excused for things like rape, because the idea is that evolutionarily they just don't care about the offspring and that they just want to, have as much sex as they possibly can. And then that, of course, is really problematic, and that's where the idea of biology mixing with human behavioral science and evolutionary psychology becomes very problematic. And so I really want to interrogate that together, and I wish we were together in person, IRL, to actually interrogate that. So in general, the theory of sexual selection is that male displays are honest signals of their genetic quality, of their genetic superiority, and those enhance the survival of their offspring, and that females of a species are just looking for the best possible genes that will ensure the best possible outcomes. Okay? There are a few additional examples of the showiness of males, right? So the peacock is a very sort of explicit example of a male that's very showy and a female that's not. Here's another great example of birds of paradise from the Planet Earth documentary. Let me just throw this up.
The character of the forest changes as you descend, becoming ever darker and damper, favouring different kinds of animals and plants. Less than 2% of the sunlight reaches the floor, but even here there is extraordinary variety. In the great island of New Guinea, there are 42 different species of birds of paradise, each more bizarre than the last. This forest is so rich that nourishing food can be gathered very quickly. That leaves the male six-plumed bird of paradise with time to concentrate on other matters, like tidying up his display area. Everything must be spick and span. All is ready. Very impressive, but no one is watching. The superb bird of paradise calls to attract a female. And he has more luck. But what does he have to do to really impress her? She retires to consider her verdict. It's hard not to feel deflated when even your best isn't good enough.
Okay, and I believe I've got one more video of a bowerbird. So that was a bird of paradise. You can see the male very showy, showing off, trying to attract the female. And then now here we've got where is it? Oh my God. A bowerbird. Yes, here we go. All right. So that's a different kind of showiness. That's less physical manifestation and more, creating something or singing a song that's very elaborate, or making a very elaborate sort of bower, for example, which we can call installation art if you want. All right. There's another video in the slides if you want to check it out of an example of this. So this is just looking at birds, at bowerbirds, and these types of tropical bird species, and kind of thinking about, and also frogs and fish, thinking about different ways that male traits are realized in this idea of sexual selection. So you have some male showiness is expressed as a song or a call. Some of it is a courtship display or a tail, right, like the peacock, or a comb, the comb. or a bower, like a little shelter, like we just watched, or body color, breast stripes, body size, all sorts of things, right? So there are different birds and fish and species, for example, that have long, intense songs. Some that have a large repertoire of songs, like a song sparrow, complex songs like a Tungara frog, etc., etc. Right? So there are lots of ways that this can be manifest in different species, depending on how natural and sexual selection have played out over many generations. But as I mentioned, I want to return to this idea that we may have some serious gender stereotypes at play here, right? There are some species where there are gender or sex reversals in the expression of these things, where actually the males are not showy and the females are not choosy. It's perhaps the other way around, where the females are showy and the males are choosy. And an example of this is in this Jacana gender reversal discussion. So I'm going to show that.
Lizzie, it's lonely as dying out there. Will you come with me?
In songbirds, if a male were to be a deadbeat dad and leave and not raise the kids would die. And basically, no genes would be passed to the next generation because the female alone can't do it.
She needs help, but he's only going to give up philandering if he believes the chicks he's staying home to help raise are his own. The result is monogamy, a social solution to a biological dilemma. Human infants are
who's going to help provide the food and the care for your young, but the neighbors are in fact higher genetic quality, perhaps more experienced, more healthy, and if your young could be sired by them, you in fact would have healthier young that carry, therefore,
male that helps feed them. Cheating, at least for certain female songbirds, gives their chicks better genes, and therefore a better chance of surviving until they can reproduce. For the wattle jacana.
Sorry, I did not mean to show that segment on cheating and monogamy. I think it's really bad, and I am going to show now this Jacana bird segment on gender, sex, role reversals, and then we can talk about that whole weird monogamy sort of cheating conversation, which I think this video is really good because it's illustrative of how problematic all of this type of science and research can be, especially when the people who you see that they have talking about all this stuff are these weird, creepy men, like seriously creepy. I found this video to be super creepy. I also should note that I didn't necessarily select this video. This is part of the whole course that we all designed together, but I do continue to show it because I think it's illustrative of how problematic all of this discourse can really be and why we should be really delicate when we talk about these things. All right, so here I'm going to show this part.
Jacanas of Panama, survival of chicks is so uncertain it's led to an amazing gender role reversal. Jacanas lose a lot of chicks to crocodiles. They might have died out long ago if they hadn't found a way to produce more offspring. Their solution? The female lays the eggs, but it's the male who keeps them warm and raises the chicks.
If a female's the one who is freed of parental care, she can produce more eggs more rapidly, and both she and the male benefit from that.
As Jacana females cut back on nurturing, their reproductive strategy began to change. Now, it's the females who care more about quantity than quality. Now it's the females who fight over mates. Over time, they've taken on traditionally male characteristics.
It's the females that are larger. Females are highly aggressive. Females compete for access to males. And a highly, quote, successful female is one who is able to accumulate and defend, if you will, a harem of 4 or even 5 mates.
When a female conquers another's territory, she often breaks the eggs and kills the chicks of the vanquished mother.
This makes sense, despite its grisliness. The male instantly becomes available to take her eggs. And in fact, that's what happens. Within hours, the female is sexually soliciting to the male. He starts mounting, and within a few days to a week, he has a clutch of eggs that are her eggs.
So here is an evolutionary revelation about gender. Male and female roles are not set in stone. They're largely determined by which sex competes for mates and which invests in the young. Solving.
All right, so that's a very important point as well, because as we talk about all of this, right, the science, which is dominated by male scientists like that creepy guy who is super creepy and problematic, deciding that males are choosy and females are choosy and males are showy, when we actually have lots of examples in the world, in nature, that this is not the case. So why is this something that we continue to talk about? I think the important thing is to remember that the gender, the sex, is not necessarily set in stone, but the way in which sexual selection is manifest is something that we do have an idea about. So that's a bit of a nuanced discussion that I hope comes through in all of this discussion here. So we talked about chicanas. Seahorses are another example of a species where the sort of quote-unquote male and female roles are quote-unquote reversed. And so casting a little bit more doubt on this like rigidity of like males do this and females do this. But before we get to that discussion, which I'm going to end this lecture with shortly, especially with a conversation in a book written by a transgender biologist, Joan Roughgarden, where she talks about all this stuff. Let's talk really quickly about the costs to sexually selected showiness in males in terms of natural selection, right? And let's talk about the peacock, and we call this the handicap principle, where these elaborate and biological costly displays are supposed to be honest signals, meaning they really honestly, truly, honest to God, communicate to the female or whoever is doing the choosing of the overall quality and the specific genetic quality or the good genes that are going to be passed on to the offspring. But over time, these traits can become exaggerated to the point where they are actually no longer helpful to the male to have. And this is known as the handicap principle, right? Where perhaps you've gone a little overboard with the honest signals, where now you have this big-ass heavy tail that actually hinders you when you're trying to escape from a predator, okay? This picture is often used as kind of a way of communicating the handicap principle in humans, but I find it to be particularly problematic, and so I think I want you to keep that in the back of your mind as we go through the next couple of slides here. Let's talk about how sexual selection and natural selection overlapped by going to the streams and pools of Trinidad and looking at a species of fish in these pools and something that happened that gives us a lot of insight into the idea of sexual selection. So in this particular type of fish, you have females and you have males. The females are larger and pretty neutrally colored. The males tend to be very showy, bright colors and a little bit smaller than the females. Here's an example of the females and the males. You can see the males have a very bright, exaggerated pattern, whereas the females, it's a bit more muted and neutral. There's also a lot of diversity in the color of males, whereas in the females, they're all approximately the same color, size, very neutral. Males have lots of different color patterns. Some have like eye-looking things on their tails and that sort of thing. Okay. So there are two types of guppies. Okay, these are guppies. And these are them. So there's a guppy in one type of stream, and then a guppy in another type of stream of the same species that look different, actually, the males. Why? Why is that the case? So these two streams, these two lakes or ponds, however you want to call them, were once connected by a stream, and the guppies could move back and forth between the two reservoirs, between the two sort of ponds. Something happened, a natural sort of occurrence, a disaster, if you want to call it that, that cut the two populations of guppies off in the different streams, or in the different ponds. In one of the ponds, there was no predator for the guppies, right? In the other pond, there was a predator for the guppies. And so in the pond that ended up getting cut off, the males started to look a lot more like the females, started to look a lot more neutral. Whereas in the other pond, the very flashy, showy, colorful, bright males persisted because there was no predator, this fish, this sea alta fish. Okay? So what this suggests is that the showiness of the male guppies was actually costly, and that over time, those males de-evolved. They evolved in the other direction. They lost that color in response to a predator, right, that could obviously see them much easier if they were very brightly colored rather than if they were neutrally colored. Okay? So over time, in the stream that was cut off with the predators, with all the predators, the males actually reverted to and became much more neutrally colored, whereas in the other stream, they remained showy. So there is a cost sometimes to showiness, and this is known as the handicap principle. This one here, the handicap principle. And this is elucidated in data. So we can see here, for example, the percent of predators first attacking the bright males versus the drab or neutrally colored males. You can see that there's a much higher likelihood of predators attacking the brightly colored males. Right? So there is a predator preference for brightly colored males. This was written up in 2003. So there is a cost to being showy. So evolution and sexual selection is all about weighing that cost versus natural selection, and also keeping in mind the Red Queen hypothesis, staying one step ahead of your predator at all time, otherwise going extinct. So this brings us back to our discussion of the investment asymmetry hypothesis and what types of stereotypes and gender, specifically gender stereotypes and human stereotypes, are coming into play here. I'm not going to show this clip of the video because this is where I find it to become very problematic when they start talking about evolutionary psychology. But I encourage you, if you want to go and watch something super problematic narrated by Liam Neeson, you can go ahead and look at this video from about minute 31:50 through like the 56-minute mark or so. I personally find the field of evolutionary psychology to be incredibly problematic, not really that scientific, not based on a lot of evidence, and basically what it's saying is that it's taking it one step further from females are choosy, males are showy, to that explains why human beings do what they do, aka why males cheat all the time, is kind of the idea. And I find that to be not only wrong, but problematic and not scientific, and not really rooted in a lot of evidence that I find very convincing. And so I actually don't really think that this is kind of as convincing of an argument as it once was, actually. I think a lot of people, scientists, researchers, are starting to pour a lot of cold water on this idea. Okay, sex also has other purposes besides simply reproduction. For example, our closest genetic relative, the bonobo, has a lot of sex. They have a lot of sex. They have sex to promote social cohesion, social harmony, pair bonding, right? So there's sexual play among juveniles. Same-sex sexual behavior is incredibly common in bonobos because they use it not just for means of reproduction, but also to form stronger social bonds, which could be a natural selective process as well. Survival. If you have stronger social bonds, you have a more close-knit family, perhaps you are more likely to survive. And, for example, female bonobos engage very often in genitogenital rubbing, where they rub their genitals together as a form of friendship, as a form of expressing friendship and kinship and enhancing the social bonds between females. So sex is really important for other purposes besides simply reproduction. So this all leads to the question of cultural normativity, right? And how this plays out in science. As I've been saying, the idea between what is objective and what is subjective. What is the human being scientist imparting on the actual objective science? Okay, and that brings us to the controversy with this theory. And so Joan Roughgarden, who is one of the sort of leading counter scientists, if you will, argues that dimorphic sexes should not be considered the norm, that there's a rainbow of sexes. She writes about it in her book, Evolution's Rainbow. Also, that sexual selection and competition are not actually as co-linked as we think. That the idea of the sort of violent competitive male is not actually because of sexual competition as much as it may be from other things. And I will post a link in the Slack from Joan Roughgarden's TED Talk where she briefly talks about this book. But I encourage you to go and do some research on this. Read about it. Normally in class I would show the link, but I want to keep this lecture to under an hour. So I will post the link for you to watch her TED Talk. It's really, really, really interesting, really, really, really informative. But Joan Roughgarden argues that instead of sexual selection, we should call it social selection. And she says that traits that differ between the sexes are not used as signals for attraction or within sexes for competition, but rather as signals meant to improve cohesion and cooperation among members of one sex. These traits have been selected to help individuals build coalitions and cooperate. So kind of going off that bonobo paradigm of sex. And that our focus on male and female sexes have biased how we think about these traits and their evolution, and that the world is not simply black and white in terms of sex. And we know this, I know this as a trans person, as a queer person, right? We know how important male and female dichotomy is in not just biology, but also sort of understanding our own lives and how problematic that can be. And so she goes on to talk about how many species have more than two sexes, that there maybe sometimes are females and primary males and secondary males. There's a lot of sequential hermaphrodism and transsexualism, for example, in blue-headed wrasses and slipper limpets. There are links also between that people have made between evolutionary biology and sexual selection and feminism, and I highly recommend this book as well. There's a couple books on here, but specifically I want to end with this, with some commentary on this paper, Male and Female Perceptions of Pair Bond Dynamics, Monogamy in Western Goals. Basically, and kind of reiterate one more time how the human filter interprets the same observations, right? Biologic observations differently. So in Western goals, female goals can be aggressive, will try to elicit copulation with males. Males are not really as dominant. Pair bonds seem to negotiate foraging and nest defense duties. Females will form pair bonds if males are not present, but no dominance hierarchy is observable. And so there is a paper looking at this Western gull population, looking at the different papers that were written about this population of Western gulls. Papers that were written by human female researchers and human male researchers coming to different conclusions looking at the same exact behavior. So if it were truly objective, if sexual selection were truly an objective science, and there were truly differences between males and females that were objective and observable, then the results should not be written up differently by female human authors and female male authors. And so there is always going to be a human filter whenever we talk about this kind of stuff, okay? So I want you to really keep that in mind when we have our conversation in the Slack and the Zoom. Okay, so this is our kind of intro to sexual selection, but hopefully we'll have a really engaging and interesting conversation about all of these things tomorrow, or when we talk about this. So this is the lecture, and I will see you in the Slack/Zoom.